These two people right here, which are Gandhi and MLK, are historical figures, and they both had one thing in common, which was they chose no violence over violence, and they stood up for what they believed in, and they did that through no violence. And I want you guys to think of somebody that did the exact opposite, but was just as influential as these people, that they used violence and they're still talked about today, and they're just as great as these guys. And if you did, it's very good for you, but I think most of you guys did not think of anybody, and that's what brings me to my topic of discussion today, which is that these violent riots are not necessary, okay? And that you can get your meaning across with peacefully protesting instead of doing these violent riots. And I want you guys to know that there's no reason for you to go out in a riot and risk having bad consequences when you can peacefully protest and convey that same meaning and do just as more, okay? That brings me to my three main topics today, which are destroys communities, it pushes your audience away, and that, why riot when why break laws, when you can peacefully protest. So it is destructive to your community, okay? It damages buildings. John Miltimore reported that in the first week of the riots after George Floyd's death, over 1,000 buildings were damaged, and it costed up to nearly $55 million, okay? Rioting and with this violence and this bad behavior can lead to things that you don't want in your city and you don't want in your community. You can also destroy the small businesses in your community, which is another thing that you don't want, You don't want to ruin the identity of the place you live in. And that's exactly what, in 1 week of these riots and after George Floyd's death did. So Christopher Brooks, who's a CBS reporter, reported that 360 small businesses across the Twin Cities suffered different levels of property damage in 1 week after George Floyd's death. And he quoted one of those small businesses, and they said they had no hope. They had no hope. Their business was completely destroyed. Their brick and mortar was completely destroyed. And no one wants that. And that is something that these riots can do, and also has economic consequences, okay? John Miltimore, again, stated that riots have economic consequences, both seen property damage and unseen decline in economic activity. So overall, these riots really can affect negatively for your community and for your city, which I know the people that are rioting, they don't want that, and they want to convey their meaning, but unfortunately it leads to consequences of destroying your community. And that brings me to my second topic of how these riots are actually pushing your audience away, okay? So this girl from Stanford, Melissa Day Witt, and she's the director of social science communications for Stanford, and they ran a study, and she found when a protest turns violent, people may perceive them as less reasonable, and in turn, this leads people to identify with them less and ultimately become less supportive. Okay, and this research was inspired by confrontations between white nationalist protesters and anti-racist counter-protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Berkeley, California. And John Miltimore, again, he backs up the extreme behaviors that lead to reduced support. And he says that he met somebody that were close to George Floyd, and they all said the same thing, that George Floyd would not want his city and the people being extremely disruptive and just burning down everything. And when that makes sense is when people see a group of people that are burning down cities, destroying the place where they live. They don't want to be associated with those people. And like that woman from Stanford said, they see them as less reasonable, and they're actually going to go to the other side. So it's really contradicting what those people are protesting for, because in reality it's not really doing anything, and it just creates more problems. Okay. Jonathan Zimmerman teaches history and education at UPenn, said that this using of violence to advance a political agenda dishonors the legacy of freedom fighters like MLK, who enlisted the victimhood and could never validate violence. And he quoted MLK who said riots are socially destructive and self-defeating, and violence will only create more problems. And so I just want you to think about that. Someone like MLK, who was so influential and great at what he did, and obviously just completely changed history, if he is saying that we need to do these peaceful protests and that violence is self-destructing, let's not do it. Let's stray away from that. And that brings me to my third point of, why break these laws when you can peacefully protest? Ryan Eccles reported that 127 people facing charges for the first week of those Minneapolis protests, and 13 of those people had arson-related charges. So why put yourself in that situation? Why risk going to jail when, in fact, the peaceful protests are actually better? And that brings me to my second point here with why they're more effective. There was a study ran by Amy Barrett and her team, who's an editorial assistant at BBC Science Fairs, and they grabbed 300 of historical violent protests and riots and protests, and they found that the non-violent protests and peaceful protests were twice as effective. In fact, they were 53% effective, and compared to the 25% of the riots. So why put yourself in those breaking laws? Why risk the consequences when you can just peacefully protest, which is something more effective, and people will see you as more reasonable as peacefully protesting. And a third point here is the historical protests that, I just wanted to show some examples of what they did. One was a Salt March, which was from Gandhi, and the second one was the Singing Revolution. And the consequence, let's just stop the violence, okay? There's no reason for it, there's no need for it, and think about the community and the consequences that come with it. Thank you.